Welcome to the Phillip Wylie Show. Take a look behind the curtain of professional hacking and hear compelling discussions with guests from diverse backgrounds who share a common curiosity and passion for challenges and their job. And now, here's your host, offensive security professional, educator, mentor, and author, Phillip Wylie.
Hello and welcome. On this episode, I have Kenny Parsons joining me today. Kenny's a member of our local Dallas-Fort Worth cybersecurity community and a member of our DEF CON 940 group in Denton, Texas. And he's given some pretty cool talks at our DC 940 meetings. He's talked about Docker and ChatGPT and some other really cool technologies. And today, Kenny's got some research that he's been doing on different technologies that he would like to share with us. And so welcome to the show, Kenny.
Thanks for having me, Phillip. Like you mentioned, my name's Kenny. I'm a cybersecurity consultant for Set Solutions, now a Trace3 company. And I'd love to share with you a little bit about a project I've been working on called PwnKube. I guess I could jump right into it.
Sure, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I've been working with Set Solutions on a DevSecOps practice and some DevSecOps projects for our clients, and from that just kind of stemmed. I was looking personally for resources to test some of these cybersecurity products out on, or at least just understand better some of the fundamentals and some of the security concepts as to, well, why are we implementing this policy or this security control, and trying to create a just kind of a showcase, I guess is the best way I could put it. So everybody's heard of Juice Shop, everybody's heard of the damn vulnerable web app and things like that. What I aimed to create was essentially that. It was an intentionally vulnerable Kubernetes deployment, a Kubernetes cluster. And so obviously I got to spin up a cluster, and so I decided to go with just a public cloud, try to make it as close to realistic as possible. And one of the things that I mentioned in my presentation to DC 940 as well as at DFW SecCon was not using principles of least privilege within the container itself and also in the orchestrator. So in particular, I talked about Kubernetes. And so I wanted to showcase, well, what are some common scenarios that we might come against in maybe an assessment or just even in our own production systems where principles of least privilege are not being adhered to, or where it's kind of sneaking past us a little bit. And an easy one to do is within Kubernetes API. It's very complex. There's a lot of moving parts. To create a simple deployment, there's a lot of different services and components that you need to deploy. And so it can be really easy to miss. So I just started doing some research on, what would it take to hack or get shell access to a container, a pod, we call it in Kubernetes, which have one or more containers. And although I didn't want to focus on the code aspect of that, because there are plenty of other applications and frameworks to show PHP, Python, whatever vulnerabilities, I just wanted one relatively simple enough that is, if we can make the assumption number one that there's a vulnerability in our web application. So that's assumption number one. Assumption number two was once we get into that shell and we have access to a container, the second assumption is that container is going to have incorrect or too broad of permissions to the Kubernetes API. And so when a new pod is spun up on a Kubernetes cluster, the secrets for communicating with the cluster are stored in that pod, usually at var Etsy or Etsy Kubernetes or Etsy certs or something like that. So they're usually stored in a very specific place. And so if we can go off of the two assumptions that there's a vulnerability in our web application, it could be a cross-site scripting, anything really. If there's a vulnerability that allows us shell access, and if principles of least privilege were not adhered to in the container itself and in the API, I wanted to demonstrate, here's our attack path. Here's a way that a cluster can get pwned. It can get owned. It can have complete control over that cluster. And so again, I just did some more research on, what would be a common introduction to the what's the word I'm looking for? A common way that someone's going to accidentally deploy this. One way is people will cluster or group things. I shouldn't use the word cluster, Kubernetes cluster, but they'll group pods and they'll group deployments based on what they're called namespaces within Kubernetes. So if you have a financial section of your business, you have a financial namespace. If you have operations, you have operations. And so they'll group things based on that, and usually permissions within those namespaces get shared. Because you're deploying an application and they all kind of just use the same. It's possible for them to use the same set of what we call a service account in Kubernetes. So I figured out how to basically create a web application that was intentionally vulnerable to a PHP injection. It could just run arbitrary code. Okay, so that's assumption number one done. So now that I have access into that deployment, I needed to find a feasible way to represent that someone could accidentally use a service account that wasn't tuned properly to its permissions. So commonly you'll have databases deployed as their own deployment within a namespace. Well, databases are a little bit different than other applications that you're deploying. They're stateful, whereas usually you'll find stateless things within a Kubernetes cluster. So when you introduce stateful applications, you usually need to have a controller, what we call a controller, to manage the deployment. So if a pod goes down, the controller knows that and can have the correct permissions to spin up a new one with all of the correct properties, storage, and all of the various things required. So if it's a Postgres database, it has permissions to recreate that pod. Because it's a stateful application, it needs to be done in a very specific way. And even then, all databases are different. So there's usually a controller for each database, or multiple controllers that you can choose from. So the assumption number two there was I used the same service account that I used for the controller, the database controller, on my PHP application, because they're one and the same. Essentially, they are part of the same monolithic application. Okay, so that's a fair assumption that you could accidentally use the same service account that you used for your database part of your application as you do for your web application. So with those two assumptions, we essentially had a full attack path into a container. We got into the container. We were able to use those permissions to launch a new container in the same namespace. But at this time, we added a few more goodies to it. We were able to add host access to the underlying host. We were able to mount that as root, create a reverse shell, get access to that, and now I have full access, root access to the underlying host. And then, that's kind of where the project is right now. It's something I've just started within the last, few weeks. But I've been able to do things like install cron jobs on the host and have it ping out to, a C2 server, things like that, just to kind of do a proof of concept. Like you've got access to everything. Now you're still subject to the way, in this case, it was an Azure cluster. Azure has particular security measures around read-only file systems, things like that. So you're still going to have some roadblocks, but in this case, on an Azure cluster, I was able to have it install a cron job on a host, on a Kubernetes what we call a worker node. And so from there, you can kind of see all the different vectors, and people like you and others in the DC 940 group could take it probably even further, being actual red and blue, purple members themselves. But anyway, that's what I wanted to build. That's what I set out to do. And this is just one attack path. There's obviously many more that we could do. But that's what I've been working on so far. So hoping to present that soon, maybe to DC 940 and also to some other local groups, and maybe even some people who want to get in on that project as well. People that have a more intimate knowledge of hacking in general and pen testing, to kind of add their knowledge to it. So that's where I'm taking the project. That's where it is. Just trying to fit that in with all my spare time. But yeah, that's PwnKube in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's very cool. It's nice to see a project like that, because that's one of the things that I've loved, that others in the information security community have created the different, like Juice Shop, Dan Vulnerable Web App, and these other applications, some of the iOS apps, and like WebGoat and some of those other ones have been good to, for people to be able to practice these skills in an environment, because, as a pen tester, you don't always get the opportunity to assess those certain things or those certain situations. So it's good to have something like that.
Absolutely. right there, what you said at the last is exactly why I built it. I wanted a chance to practice. I wanted a chance to prove this is why we go through the work of creating service accounts. We go through the work of auditing these service accounts, because that's, in this case, it led to a full host, pwnage.
Yeah, that's pretty serious and a good way to demonstrate to people the criticality of the security of Kubernetes. So when do you think you'll have, because I know you said this is still work in progress, so once you get this published, you'll put this on a GitHub project out there somewhere?
Yeah, I've got right now it's private, but I'll put out there a GitHub repo with real basic install instructions, not using any complicated commands, just, kube control apply, and it just deploys everything. And then there'll kind of be a wiki of here's how you, again, we're not focusing on the code vulnerabilities, Juice Shop and all these others, they worry about that, but we'll give you the entry point. We'll give you assumption number one, you go figure the rest out. I've talked with other people that have made really great suggestions, and this is where I hope to take it. Once we kind of get this built out and we have this on a public repo where people can deploy it, I'd love to see this in more like a CTF format, or just a leaderboard. I'm obviously not going to compete with Hack the Box or things like that, but you get the idea. I want people to be able to go in and find some tidbits, access a database, and retrieve, a list of customers or users or whatever, and just kind of prove like I've got this flag. So I'd love to get it into a CTF or a tokenized format, maybe like a workshop. But all of that just means we need to add on different scenarios. And so those who are very well versed in deployments, in running microservices, I'd love to get their input as well. And so that's where I plan on taking it. Right now, I'm just kind of drawing on my own experience. But once I get it out there, I'm hoping to open it up so that others can say, hey, here's a potential attack path. Let's add that in there, and kind of update it so that people can get access to it.
Yeah, I like that CTF idea too, because that would be really great to host at some conferences, by besides DFW. Maybe you'll have enough progress that you could look at doing something there. Yeah,
my kids would need to give me a lot more free time in the evening, but yeah, that's the goal, of to get connected with others. And, through DevSecCon, I'm sure we'll meet a lot of individuals who have some ideas, and I'd love to kind of make that a pet project of DevSecCon Dallas.
Yeah, when you get ready to start sharing information on, of course, let's go out on the podcast, but any new updates or things you want to share, I'd be happy to share with you and get it out there, and maybe you can get some other people to come up and help with some ideas that possibly enhance what you've started.
Absolutely, we need it. The community needs it for sure.
Well, I appreciate you joining to share this research and your project. I think it's a great idea. Thanks for doing that and contributing to the community. Is there anything else you want to share before we end this episode?
No, again, just thank you for having me on, and allowing me to share some of my nerdy obsessions with containers and security and everything in between. So thank you for your platform, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for joining. We need people like yourself sharing. I mean, I think people are setting a good example. When you're doing this, others coming into the game or haven't been in that long, kind of encouraging them to share, which I think is a good thing. Back when I got into IT back in '97, and I think it's changed, because I know it has with securities. People weren't so quickly to share within organizations. You would have some of these Unix administrators that did want to share their secret sauce because they felt like maybe they would lose their job security if they taught someone else. And so now I think it's really great that the communities have evolved where people are trying to share, because when you share and you're working in an environment where you're teaching others how to do things, you're making your life easier.
You are.
Because when you're not sharing, how do you go on vacation? How do you take time off if
Absolutely.
you're not doing that?
Yeah, I 100% agree. So thank you for giving us all the platform to do that.
Well, thanks again. And thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to the Phillip Wylie Show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. In the meantime, to learn more about Phillip, go to thehackermaker.com and connect with him on LinkedIn and Twitter @Phillip Wylie. Until next time.